I'm Matt Michelson, a financial professional. I believe that the financial services that are available to wealthy people should be made available to everybody. And we're going to continue. We've given you some of those things already, and we're going to continue with more of that tonight. So we are in week 3. Tonight's lesson is how money grows. So we're in this section, or we're in the phase where we're still talking about today. How can you help yourself right now to get yourself in a better place? And soon, after the next couple lessons, we'll be looking at how can you help yourself in the near future and then in the distant future. So remember that your homework's not gradable. We don't grade you, but really your grade shows up in your results. So 20 years from now, your kids are going to let you know how well you've done. As part of your homework assignment, you should have already calculated your weekly income and bills. That's actually from the first week. You should have selected a weekly savings goal or set a savings goal for yourself, and then calculated that weekly spendable number. As you calculated your weekly spendable number, we gave you the challenge last week to start living by that simplified budgeting method and living within that spendable number. So again, your income minus your bills minus your savings equals that guilt-free spendable number. So cannot emphasize how important those 4 numbers are for you. It's a simple exercise, and it's really going to help you throughout the entire boot camp, and honestly for the rest of your life beyond the boot camp, which is really what we want for you. Tonight, we're going to talk about money leaks. We're going to talk a little bit about debt elimination, actually not tonight, but in future lessons. And those, you're only going to know how to handle money leaks and debt elimination if you're not going to be able to do it if you don't know what your bills are. You don't know what those debts are. We're going, in general, how are you going to know if you're staying on track if you don't know what these numbers are? So again, don't skip the homework. Just you're building your financial future and your financial plan for your future, just one step at a time with each lesson. So enough of that. Let's get started with the topic of today's lesson. How money grows, the rules of the money game. So stop for a second and think to yourself, what lessons did my parents teach me about financial success? How does it happen? Where does it come from? We're taught that if we follow certain rules, we'll be financially successful. So the rules we're taught is, when you're young, go to school and get good grades, stay in school, get good grades, study hard. Then if you've done that, you'll get into college. So go to college, and once you graduate from college, you'll get a good job. And from that good job, you're going to make lots of money and retire comfortably, right? So that's what we've been told. That's what we've told how the story goes. But unfortunately, somehow still a full third of Americans are financially unsatisfied. So when 1 out of 3 people on this, at this meeting tonight are feeling financially unsatisfied, and potentially more than that, since you're here taking a financial course, that's probably means that you're unsatisfied with where you're at and you want to get somewhere better. So at least 1 out of 3 people here are financially unsatisfied. So where did we go wrong with these rules? Remember, let's take a step back to the Joneses and the Smiths. Remember those 2 families? They both followed these rules, but they still ended up in completely different places. So all this adds up to something that's missing from these rules. There must mean that there's some critical rules that are missing from the list. Here's actually what they are. The rules that you have not been taught, that you should have been taught, is learn how money works. That's 1. Have a financial plan. That's 2. And stick to the plan. That's 3. So the reason why you haven't been taught those rules is most likely your parents or your teachers or other adults in your life, they didn't know about these either. So I'll repeat it. Learn how money works. So you're doing that right now here in this course. Have a financial plan. You're doing that right now here in this course. Stick to your plan. Part of this boot camp is we're challenging you to take these steps and stick to that plan. So let's look at what the Smiths did differently than the Joneses to get better results. So here's Mr. Jones on the left, because he doesn't know how money works. He hasn't taken this course. He really doesn't have a financial plan. So what he does, he just spends money on what he feels like spending money on. So he buys the latest smartphone. Every time a new model comes out each year, he buys the latest to replace the model, last year's model that still worked perfectly fine. So he doesn't think about how this impulse purchase or this impulse buy erodes his financial future. So take the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people like Mr. Jones that are out there in his similar situation, who are all buying these phones. Well, all of their money flows to the manufacturer. Now, the manufacturer has people that invest in the phone manufacturing company. And so people like the Smiths. So the Smiths are invested in the company. And Mr. Smith, he knows how money works and he has a financial plan. He took our course, right? This imaginary Mr. Jones, or sorry, Mr. Smith. So he already has a smartphone, but he paid cash for it and it was 3 years ago. So he hasn't bought a new phone for the last 2 years because his older phone still works perfectly fine for his needs. So instead of buying a new phone every year for the previous 2 years, he took that money he would have spent on a new phone and he buys stock in the manufacturer instead. So he invests his money, instead of buying a phone, into a stock. And that stock, as it grows in value, it provides him money that he didn't even have to work for because he learned how money works and he stuck to his plan. So the money from Mr. Jones and many people like him flows through to the company and into the pockets of the Smiths. Let's look at another scenario, a little bit more complicated here. I wouldn't say complicated, but there's more moving parts. So in the earlier scenario, Mr. Jones paid $1,000 for that phone just out of his pocket, right? But let's say he needs to buy something that's bigger, that he doesn't have enough money in his pocket to buy a new car, a new truck in this case. So let's say he wanted to buy a $40,000 truck from Ford. And but he doesn't have that $40,000 of his own. So he goes to Chase Bank and he borrows the $40,000. Now, he owes interest on that debt that he now has to pay back to the bank. So he borrows $40,000 from the bank and he pays the bank back 6% interest for the next 6 years. So let's see where that money flows. So he takes the $40,000 borrowed from the bank, he buys the truck, the money goes to Ford, and here's Mr. Smith on the far side of the equation here. Mr. Smith has also bought stock in Ford. Mr. Smith drives an older car, and instead of buying the brand new latest car, he takes what money he would have spent on a new car and invests it in the company. So now the company pays money to, or shares profits with their investors, and Mr. Smith has now earned $400 on the $40,000 that Mr. Jones put into, Mr. Jones and many, many people like him paid into the company. Now, there's also the loan from the bank. So that $40,000 has to be paid back with additional interest. So over time, Mr. Jones pays $7,500 in interest to the bank. That's profit for the bank. The bank then turns around and shares some of those profits with their investors. And well, a lucky guess, here's Mr. Smith on the right side here, who is also invested in the bank. So now we see that Mr. Jones has a new car and additional debt, while Mr. Smith has $500 in his pocket every single month that he doesn't even have to work for. It all just comes with him, to him, passively. So what's the major takeaway from this slide, for these last couple slides? You really need to know how money works so you can make it work for you, because if you don't know how it works, it can work against you. So if you don't know the right rules, it'll be almost impossible for yourself and for your family to win the money game. So families who don't know the rules, They tend to pay higher taxes. They tend to have far higher living expenses. They tend to have much greater amount of debt. And, if they're able to save it all, their savings is very, very minimum. But there's even more to it than that. Even if someone who doesn't know the right rules decides to save, they're going to likely end up making costly mistakes because they don't know, they do what they're told, just like those earlier rules of the game that missed the most important ones. There are other things like where to put your money, where to save it, where to invest it, that the people who don't have the right financial education will end up putting that what little savings they can save in potentially in the wrong places, likely in the wrong places, and end up, their savings ends up not helping them as much as it could. So you've learned how to make money by going to school for all those years, but you may not have been taught how to save it properly. So conventional wisdom, again, going back to the wisdom of the people who are untrained and not financially educated, conventional wisdom is put your money in a bank account. Because why? Why would you put your money in a bank account? For most people, the answer is it's perceived as safe. Really, in just a minute here, I'm actually going to tell you why that's not always the safest bet. But back to the point, what do you get in exchange for the perceived safety of putting your money in the bank? Well, what banks give you is a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of interest. It's only a fraction of a percent. So the average interest rate for a savings account is 0.06%. That's almost nothing. It would take over 1,000 years for your money to double sitting in a bank account at that interest rate. The average interest rate for a 1-year certificate of deposit from a bank, so a CD, they give you a quote unquote much higher interest rate than a savings account, but it's only 0.42%. It's not even 0.5% that you get on a 1-year CD, and your money is tied up, and you incur a lot of fees if you want to pull that money out before that 1 year is up. If you put your money, lock it away in the bank for 5 years in a 5-year CD, you get just over 0.5%. So all these interest rates that you're getting paid from the bank is almost nothing. And crazy thing about all of it is that there's over $12 trillion that Americans are keeping in these type of accounts. Huge chunk of people's savings is kept there, again, because people don't know any better. Now, don't get me wrong. Banks have a purpose. They are necessary and they're an important part of the big financial picture. But, they're very useful for very specific reasons. Like having quick access to money for daily spending or an emergency. But when it comes to long-term savings, it's highly ineffective. Your money's sitting there earning less than inflation. And we're going to talk about what that means here in just a minute. So you're actually losing money over time. And if you have your money in one of these CDs, you're going to get penalized with high fees if you want to take it out early to use for whatever reasons you might need. So before I move to the next slide, ask yourself, does your money work as hard for you as you do for your money? And I guarantee you, if it's sitting in a bank, it's not working for you. So here's inflation and what that means. It basically boils down to reduced buying power. So here we have 3 different $20 bills. The current one today in 2020, you see this on the far right, that's what it looks like today. 30 years ago, that's what a $20 bill looked like. 30 years before that, in 1960, that's what a $20 bill looked like. And you can see for $20 how much the shopping basket or the shopping cart looks like for each of these years. And you can see that over time, that $20 used to buy a lot of groceries. And over time, it comes down drastically. That's because the value of each dollar becomes less and less over time. So every time the government prints another dollar bill, or creates another dollar bill, they're basically creating money out of thin air and they're putting it into the economy with all the other dollar bills that have been printed. Think of it as your friends are coming over, you're making soup for dinner, and all of a sudden friends announce that they're coming over to have dinner with you. Well, you just add a bunch of water to the soup, right? Just so that there'll be more for everybody. But what does that do to the soup? It waters it down. It makes it less flavorful. It doesn't add to the nutrients. It's just all the flavors and nutrients that were in the soup originally now get diluted because there's so much more water poured in. So if you think about the amount of goods and services that are available in an economy, if you keep pumping cash into that economy and the same amount of goods, it's going to dilute the value of all those dollars. So in past years, inflation reached as high as 20%, while other years were much lower. But the average rate of inflation over the last 100 years in the United States is around 3%. 3% is actually on the low end of inflation estimates. Some I've seen estimates as high as 7%. But let's just use 3% as a starting point for our conversation tonight. So today it takes almost $4 in today's money to buy what only cost $2 in 1990 and what cost less than $1 in 1960. And let's say this trend continues at 3% inflation per year for the next 30 years. So in the year 2050, it'll take almost $10 to buy in 2050 what cost $4 to buy today. So long story short, this isn't an entire lesson built around inflation, but what you really need to know is you need to be sure your money, where it's sitting, where it's being saved, is growing faster than inflation so that you don't lose all your buying power in the future. You don't want to get to retirement only discover that your $1 million only buys you half of what you thought it would. So hopefully by now, you know that you need to plan ahead, you need to save, you need to invest, and you need to do all this to keep ahead of inflation, right? And not just let your long-term savings sit there in the bank and start getting watered down by that inflation. So in the rest of tonight's lesson, I'm going to teach you how much impact these interests or these percentages create and how that all works. The interest. Now, interest can work for you or against you, remember that. But let's look at how it works for you. So scenario A, we have your money is earning 1%. Scenario B, you have it earning 8%. That's the 7 degrees of separation here. When you take $100,000 and you invest it for 30 years at 1% interest, your money will grow to just over $134,000. And you think to yourself, maybe you're thinking, well, $34,000 gain, that's not that bad. But if you imagine that's over 30 years, that's actually, that's a terrible rate of growth, right? Scenario B, if your money's earning 8%, in the same amount of time, you'll have over $1 million. So that's a huge difference. And the magic behind that difference is what's called compounding interest. And here's how that works. So when the principal money that you originally invest, that's your original money that you put into an investment. When that principal earns interest, you reinvest the interest that's earned. That's why it's called compounding. And here's how that works. Here, we'll take simple interest first and show you how that works before we show you compounding. Simple interest, you start with $100 as your principal in this example, and you invest it for 1 year. And the next year, you've earned $10. So $10, this is if you're earning 10% interest on that $100. So now your $100 has turned into 110. And in year 3, you earn an additional 10 because again, your $100 at 10% interest gives you another $10 in year 3. So over time, you're basically earning an additional $10 per year at this 10% interest. So in year 5, you'll have $140. Now, compounding interest, let's look at this by comparison. In this scenario, we start with the same principal amount, $100, and we're earning the same amount of return, 10%. So year two, you're going to produce an identical result to your simple interest scenario, and you're only going to earn you're going to earn $10 in that next year. It's because you're starting with 100, multiply that by 10% interest, and here's your $10. Now in year three is actually where it really starts to where the magic begins to happen. In year three, the interest earned isn't just based on the $100 you started with, but it's also based off the additional $10 you earned in year two. So now you have an additional $10 from 10% of your 100, and you have an additional $1 based off of your 10%, $10 from that you earned the year before. So over the next 5 years, simple interest would have given you $140, and compounding interest gives you $146.41. You might be thinking, well, $6.41 isn't all that much, but this is only in 5 years. That $6.41 is going to keep earning money and more money and more money and more money over time. And I'll show you in a second what that looks like. But also think about this. $6.41 is 16% higher than the $40 that you've earned. So just in 5 years, you've earned 16% more interest than you would have if you were just getting simple interest. Here's how that looks when you compare the two. You have your, in this scenario, you have $1,000 you've invested. That's the blue here at the bottom. It's earning 10% interest, and this is over 20 years. If you have simple interest, you're just going to earn what's here in the red. Not bad. So over 20 years, you're going to earn an additional $2,000. But if your interest is compounding and you have compounding interest, that results in $6,328 earned from that original $1,000 investment. That's more than triple what simple interest makes you over those 20 years. Now, that's a big, big difference. You don't have to take my word for it, though. We're going to look at a couple really smart people here who've had tremendous success with the help of compound interest. First one we'll talk about is Warren Buffett. He's known as the Oracle of Omaha, is his nickname. He was born in 1930, and he started investing when he was only 10 years old. He's one of the wealthiest people today, with a net worth of around $70 billion. Now that number changes day to day because of where the markets are at and how his investments are valued at any given day. But and one day he could lose 10 billion and the next day he can make it back and then some. So let's just use 70 billion as a nice rough number. Over 99% of his wealth was accumulated after he turned 50 years old. You can see from the chart here. When he was interviewed and asked about the primary factors that led to his amazing wealth, he attributed it to three things. My wealth has come from a combination of living in America, having some lucky genes, and compound interest. It's interesting that he called that out specifically. Now, the quote doesn't have that he continued on following this quote about compound interest. He said, it's a simple concept, but over time it accomplishes extraordinary things. Albert Einstein, another incredible mind, said, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. So how does this concept of compound interest work mathematically? What's the math behind it? Well, this is the formula that you'll need to know. The principal amount, the amount at the end, annual interest rate, the time in years, the number of times per year the interest is compounded. You have all that together and forget about it. You don't need to know any of that. Albert Einstein actually came up with a way to really condense this down in a way that the average person can understand it and have it be useful. Luckily for you and me. And here's what he came up with. We call it the rule of 72. You may have heard that before. With the rule of 72, there's really only one variable that you have to learn, and that's your rate of return. So 72 is a constant. It never changes. And all you need to know is to take whatever your rate of return is and divide it into 72. And that's going to tell you the amount of time it's going to take in years for your investment to double. So let's look at an example here. Let's say you're a cute little baby and your parents invest $10,000 for you at 2% interest. Your money doubles. You take that 72, the rule of 72, you divide that by 2%, which is the interest that you're earning annually. And that gives you 36 years. So 36 years later, your money grows from 10,000 to 20,000. And from 37 to age 73, another 36 years, it doubles again to 40,000. And when you get to age 110, you've earned 80,000. So by age 110, you'll have $80,000, which really isn't that much considering how long your money's been at work. Your money's been at work for 109 years. And this baby isn't so cute anymore. Let's look at what 6% would look like. So take your rule of 72, you divide into that 6%, and that gives you 12 years. So that means the same 1-year-old baby would double their money would double their money at age 13, again at age 25, and so forth till age 61. That baby would have $320,000. Not bad. Let's look at 12%. Rule of 72 divided by 12%, 6 years. So this baby's money would double every 6 years. So by the time the baby is 31 years old, we'll have the same amount, $320,000. Now, quick disclaimer here, 12% is really optimistic and it's difficult to achieve in the long run. But we're just using it to demonstrate how the formula works and not to provide false expectations to anybody. It's also not realistic for a baby to start investing at age 1. But you parents out there and grandparents, you can set up your kids and grandkids for life, financially, with $1 million baby program that we're going to teach you about in lesson 12. So you're going to want to stick around for that lesson for sure. The program may not allow your kid to retire at age 31, but it will certainly give them a huge financial head start. It can help them pay for college, pay for their first home, eventually, help fund their eventual retirement. You're definitely not going to want to miss that lesson. So let's go back to revisit the first scenario really quick, because there's a very important point that I want to emphasize. Remember that inflation is averaging 3%. So it's eating away at this investment faster than it's growing at 2%. So your $80,000 at age 110 will probably buy you less than your original 10,000 that you started with as a baby. Remember how banks only pay you 0.06% for savings accounts? Again, that's going to take 1,200 years to double. It's just not worth it. If you get that high return CD from the same bank, it will only take you 118 years for your money to double. It's just not worth it. So yes, sure, banks insure your money so it won't get lost if the bank closes, or, but their poor returns, they just don't protect your money from inflation. So in short, banks aren't as safe as conventional wisdom says they are. If they were, millions of regular people who keep all their money stashed in banks would be thriving financially, and that's just not the case. So in upcoming lessons, we're also going to show you other places that the wealthy use where your money is insured like banks. You don't have to worry about inflation eroding away your savings, and you kind of get the best of both worlds. So again, stick around for that. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. This chart just kind of reflects what we've already seen, this rule of 72 and what it looks like at different interest rates and how it grows by retirement age. But think to yourself for a second, where is your money currently invested? And what kind of interest rates is it earning for you? Is that level of interest, is that going to get you closer to your financial independence number, especially when you consider inflation is dragging you back the other direction, away from your goal? And lastly, think about what can you do to help yourself get to that number faster, to get to your financial goal number faster. Chances are pretty good if you've got all your money saved in the bank, you want to put it somewhere different. So one answer to helping you get to your financial goal more quickly is start saving early. So compound interest, it really works its magic, as I showed you before with the Warren Buffett slide, really works its magic when it has time, enough time to do so. So take a look at this chart here. If you want to have $1 million in retirement, you really only need to save $310 a month at age 20. At age 30, you're going to need to save $625 a month. So that 10-year difference, you need to more than double the amount to make that $1 million goal. At age 40, you need to save $1,335 a month, and so on. So as you can see, it's so much more effective to start saving as soon as possible. And don't ever think it's too late. Just get started now, and you're going to thank yourself later on the sooner you get started. So let's go back to Einstein for a second. And there's a second part of the quote that I mentioned earlier that's equally as important as the first that I skipped over. I don't know if you noticed that. Compound interest, the eighth wonder of the world. He who earns it, understands it, earns it. He who doesn't pays it. So let's look at how it can work against you. So imagine for a second, you've got a credit card balance of $5,000. Not too hard for most people to imagine because they've got that and a lot more. But credit card balance of $5,000. The credit card's interest rate is 20%. Now, what's 20% of $5,000 is $1,000. So most people will think, oh, I'm going to pay $1,000 in interest on this credit card, when I pay it off. I want to make that minimum monthly payment of $150, and I'm going to pay it off over 50 months. So do you really pay $1,000 in interest? No, because that interest is compounding. And because it's compounding, it's building faster than you're paying it off in many senses. Eventually, you'll pay the $5,000 off, but you're not going to pay $1,000 in interest. You're going to pay $2,359 in interest because it's compounding against you. So think for a second that nearly 10% of people under the age of 30 have 90 days past due credit balances, meaning they're extremely late on paying back the money that they owe on these credit cards. Couple that with student loan debt, where the average person carries around $33,000 in student loan debt. And you can see how that debt can snowball and grow very quickly against these people. So again, he who understands interest, compounding interest, earns it. He who doesn't pays it. Look at this scenario with the Joneses and the Smiths. Remember, the Joneses borrowed $40,000 for that truck, paying 6% for over 6 years. The Smiths, on the other hand, they invested $40,000 and earning 6% over 6 years. So one of them is going to pay $7,500 total. The other is going to earn $7,500 total. So Mr. Jones paid the money, Mr. Smith earned the money. The net difference between both of their results is $15,000. That's a huge gap. Again, he who understands it earns it, he who doesn't pays it. So there's 2 rules of money. While studying at Columbia University, Warren Buffett, he developed his 2 rules that he still swears by. Rule number 1, never lose money. Rule number 2, never forget rule number 1. Well, we also have 2 rules of borrowing. What we believe firmly is that you can borrow money, but only in 2 situations makes sense. One is if it's going to increase, if you're using it to buy something that increases your income, that produces more income than the debt costs you. Also, if it forces you to save, if it builds equity, So borrowing for something like a house builds equity over time. It forces savings that you might otherwise spend that money on consumption. Every other kind of debt, we definitely say don't do it. So before taking on any debt, think if you're going to have that debt, if that debt's going to create an asset for you, and whether or not that asset will produce more income than it's going to cost you in interest paid out. So there are other ways you could be losing money. We're going to be expanding on this topic in the next lesson, so I'm not going to go in great detail here, but just take a look for a second at these money leaks and think about if they're relevant to your financial situation, and keep them in mind when you come back for lesson 4, because we're going to tell you how to get rid of these, all of them and more. Bank fees, not paying off high interest debt that we just talked about, keeping money in low interest accounts, mentioned that earlier in the lesson, having unused subscriptions, things you're paying for and not using, buying things you don't really need, overpaying for insurance, overpaying on taxes. That means you're getting a huge check at the end of the year after you file your taxes. If you're getting a multi-$1,000 check back from the government, that means you've overpaid taxes. Yes, you're getting it back, but who was in control of your money that entire time? It wasn't you. We're going to talk about that in the next lesson. And high 401k fees or high investment account fees. These are all things that are eating away at your money. So before I end things, before I wrap things up, I just want you to remember the major takeaways from this lesson. Having a financial plan is absolutely crucial to your success. You need to know how money works, so continue to keep attending these bootcamp lessons, and that's coming. That's going to come. It's already started. And you need to know how to make money work for you so it's not working against you. And lastly, you need to stick to the plan that you're already starting to create and get started early, because remember, this is a long-term game. If you haven't already gotten started, again, the time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but since you can't go back in time, the second best time to start is right now. If you've completed your homework lessons for 1 and 2, today's assignment should be really easy for you to complete. If you've not done your previous assignments yet, you'll want to catch up. You'll need to know your weekly savings to complete today's assignment. So once you know your weekly savings, you'll need to calculate how much money you can save in a year if you keep that challenge. You'll calculate how much this money that savings that you're going to have in a year. Now that you know the rule of 72, you're going to see how fast that can grow in 30 years. Let's say if you invested at 6%, or if you invested at 8%, how quickly will it take that amount to double? And what amount will you be looking like when you get to your retirement age? Just one quick note to think about here is, if you save $100 a week and you invested at just 8%, you're going to have $1,000 a week to live off of in 30 years. Essentially, $100 now gives you $1,000 in retirement. Sounds like a pretty good deal, if you ask me. So, that's why you want to calculate what those numbers will look like for you. We're going to show you how to find money you did not know you already have. Some people were able to save $1,000 a month from previous boot camps we've had just following these tips. So what would you do with an extra $1,000 every month? How would that help you if we can help you find that? Would you spend it on vacation? Would you, invest it for retirement? Would you spend it on things that you truly love? Be sure to attend next week to find money you didn't know you have. And we're not going to be talking about, how to save pennies here and there and coupon clipping and things like that. This is real savings, real money. So 2 last takeaways, humorous takeaways from this lesson, is make sure your compound interest is working for you, not against you, like Batman is teaching Robin here. And don't be like Dr. Evil and reach retirement only to learn that your money isn't worth very much because of inflation. So thank you for attending tonight. Happy to be on this journey with you and looking forward to having you in the next lesson.